Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome to Oblong Online. I'm Helen Sadlowski, and we're getting a little feedback here, so I'm just going to mute our guests here. I'm the events director for Oblong Books, and before I welcome our poets this evening, I'd like to let you know if you have any questions for either of our readers, you can type them either in the chat on the right-hand side of the screen, or there's a little ask a question module at the bottom of your screen, and you can put them in there as well, and we'll address them at the end of the program. For those of you who'd like to buy a signed copy of either of the books that we're featuring this evening, and that is Tessa Kale's Crow's Cup and Mark Wunderlich's God of Nothingness, there's a little buy the book button at the bottom of your screen, and that takes you to Oblong Books website. We ship all over the country, we even ship all over the world, and we can set you up with signed copies by both Tessa and Mark. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our guests this evening, poets Mark Wunderlich and Tessa Kale. Mark will be reading from his new collection, God of Nothingness, which was just recently published by Grey Wolf Press, in which he examines the very difficult questions: how is it we go on when those around us die, and why go on at all? The collection isn't depressing. It's actually a brilliant testament to the human ability to make something tough-minded and resilient out of despair. Mark is the director of the Bennington Writers Seminar at Bennington College in Vermont, and he is the author of 3 other critically acclaimed books of poetry: The Anchorage, which received the Lambda Literary Award, Voluntary Servitude, and The Earth Avails, which was a finalist for the Kingsley Tufts Award and which also received the 2015 Rilke Prize. His poems, interviews, reviews, and translations have appeared in journals such as Slate, the Paris Review, and Poetry, and his work has appeared in over 30 anthologies. Welcome, Mark. Tessa Kale is the author of the prize-winning chapbook, The Hudson Line, and her poems have been published in the Yale Review, the Western Humanities Review, Prelude, and other publications. She's a graduate of Columbia University's MFA program and an editor of the Columbia Granger's World of Poetry. Tessa will read to us this evening from her new and first published full collection of poetry, Crow's Cup, which received the 2020 Red Mountain Discovery Award. The poems in Crow's Cup range from Hudson River scenes, past and present, to Neolithic Europe, from 19th century Hamburg to 1970s performance art, in poems that capture the wonder and fragility of worlds within and without. The interplay of art and nature, of culture and climate, lies at the heart of this award-winning collection. Welcome, Tessa. Both collections are so relevant to the situation we find ourselves in today, which is why we invited Mark and Tessa to read for us this evening. We're bombarded by the enormity of the death toll due to the pandemic, and many of us are seeking solace and comfort in landscape, art, music, and nature. Mark and Tessa will each read a few poems, and we will alternate between the readers. And we're going to begin with Mark. So I'm just going to open Mark's mic. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Tessa and I are going to disappear, so enjoy.
All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone at Oblong Books and to all of you out there who are joining this evening. I've had a little bit of technical problems, so if I disappear, I believe you'll still be able to hear my mic. I'll just refresh my screen and reappear, so don't be too alarmed. And also, I'm thrilled to be reading with Tessa tonight, and I just wanted to congratulate her on her recent publication. I'm going to read a poem. The first poem I will read is one that's actually set here in the house from which where I'm reading, and it's called Haunted House. I moved into the haunted house and gutted it to the bones. I wasn't alone then and worked there in a team. We evicted squirrels from their vast nutshell nest, filled dumpsters with 50 years of trash. I found 3 lit and ornamented trees in a pile of brush, uncovered secret drawings in a drawer, We tore up a floor to uncover a floor, sanded tulip poplar to a sheen. I let the others unhouse the rat snake muscled around the boiler pipes downstairs. They took it in a pail to Corlairs Creek, where it braided angrily away. I too slithered in the muddy crawl space, headlamp sputtering with sweat. When the house began to wake, the strangers began to arrive, driving their cars up our long drive to have a proper snoop. Uninvited, they told of Dutch Mary rocking in her scarf, dead slaves buried in a hollow up the hill, the wellhead by the Indian Trail where carriages stopped to let their long dead horses have a drink. If you think this scared me, you'd be wrong. I know a story meant to frighten when I hear one. I live here alone with the spirits I cannot see. I spend my days inside these rubble stone walls, cooking small meals and stoking logs into a smoking stove, while around me history stills to pictures in a frame, the same clouded view for old Dutch Mary waiting at the window once again. This next poem is set in my hometown in Wisconsin, refers to it. It's a very small town called Fountain City. And this poem is called Shanti. No one remembers what became of the people in the house now swaybacked in the marsh. Not the mice whispering and tunneled in the couch. Not the snapping turtle armored on a log, retracting his hard beak into wrinkled folds like foreskin. Not my mother, who visited the shanty once as a nurse, noting the packed dirt floor, the walls pasted up in newsprint. They burnt waste oil in a barrel stove they got free from a garage, dipped their water from a spring now greened with cress. Artist Kyle Holtz knew something of the wife, but couldn't think, what was she called to home? When I was small, I heard roosters crowing from their yard and think I rode a school bus with the girl, but now I couldn't say for sure. Bill Went taught me to trap muskrats in that swamp, staking a conibear in the muddy muskrat runs with brush. I pulled their plush-furred bodies from the ice, sold them for cash money to the fur man in the spring. How long will I keep telling stories just like this? Dirt floors and trap lines and a shack abandoned in a swamp. The vividness of that world is fading, like my father's addled mind. Poverty is not poetry, this I know. But these pictures are what's left of childhood, and now all my male relatives are gone, though lost and half remembering, my father living on. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tessa.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm certainly thrilled to be reading with you. My thanks to everyone for joining us, and thanks especially to Helen and everyone at Oblong.
Tessa, I don't mean to interrupt your introduction. You were having a little bit of a feedback. Do you have perhaps another tab open on your computer? Bear with us, everyone. We'll be with you in a minute. Ooh.
How's that?
It's a little better. If you have Crowdcast open in one other, try turning your volume down as well. All right. I think it's going to interfere with your reading, Tessa. I think perhaps, Mark, would you be willing to read again while Tessa and I sort this out? Okay, Mark, would you mind going
Yep.
a little bit out of sequence, and I'll call Tessa. We'll sort this out and we'll be right back.
Sure thing. And good luck sorting out the technical difficulties there. It's our new technical reality, our ghost world that we inhabit here in our televisions. So I'm going to go ahead and read another poem. And this one might require a little bit of setup. Some time ago, in this book, there's a series of poems. I have a group of 5 poems that are all set in places near the Arctic Circle. Some of them north of the Arctic Circle. They're prose poems. They're meant to be kind of travelogues and sort of elements of reflection about those places. For a long time, I was really fascinated with, going to places, cold places in the winter. And this next poem is in Finland. It's in far northern Finland, in a town called Hämeenkyrö. And it begins, and the title of this prose poem is Hämeenkyrö, Finland. And it begins with a quote. At last they came to Finnmark and knocked on the Finn woman's chimney, for she hadn't a sign of a door, from The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. At the sauna, the women lean their heads together and murmur. They wear sturdy swimwear and plastic clogs and knit hats. On the benches, we sweat in the low light, while a man dips water from the reservoir with a neat scoop on a pole, filling the air with steam. The heat is personal and draws you into yourself, hands over your face to keep from burning. On the benches, we lean forward, the air filling with our inner water. In Finnish, a woman directs us to follow her. She is bossy and has the authority of a captain. Through the chambers, we exit into the night, the paths ice-covered and slick. We follow her sturdy body to the pier where we turn to face the others and, gripping the rails, lower ourselves through the hole in the ice into the black water. We leave our heat behind, sent to the bottom of the lake, the body filled and emptied, burnished pink and infantile. An old man tells me he loves books and he reads a great deal while he takes off his clothes. He wears a string of wooden beads around his neck and puts a small wool cap upon his head. He's lean and robust, hairless, skin and flesh firm. I admire him. He carries a green bottle corked and half full of a mysterious silted drink. We duck into the smoke sauna, a blackened cabin over baking stones. We darken and stoop under a roof of soot. The stove is our mother, pushing her heat onto us, pouring it onto us, dizzying and irradiating the pink spiders of our lungs, searing the bottoms of our feet. Heat and ice, heat and ice. The lake keeps the eye of night at the bottom. The mouth of winter is the hole we climb into, jagged with teeth of ice. The mind blinds itself, scorched and frozen, dumb to thought. The body seeks the extreme. Cool me and heat me, cool and heat, mother, remake me here in the snow. And while they're still attending to technical things, I'll read another poem. Oh, unless Tessa's up?
We're up.
Great. I'll turn it over to Tessa.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Yep, you bet.
Sounds much better now, right?
Yes.
So my thanks to everyone also for joining us, and thanks especially to Helen and everyone at Oblong, which is our very favorite bookstore. In the part of the Hudson Valley where we live, enormous flocks of crows congregate every year for their winter roosting. To see them flying overhead by the thousands is an exhilarating sight, and they're the inspiration for this poem. Winter crows. Winter again, at last. I have sorely missed the crows' glorious and deafening evensong. Not the sweet lyricists, they bring an epic on silhouette in the gold sky, each letter on strong wings, each flap of wings strikes a new note. On windy days, the joy of flying sideways. It's been a difficult year for everyone, collectively and individually. In addition to everything else that's going on, we lost two beloved animals, our 12-year-old Great Pyrenees and our 12-year-old cat. Mark, your very powerful poem, Death of a Cat, hit me hard. But our hound, Willa, also 12, is going strong as ever, and this poem is about her. Freedom of Willa. 1. You can't let a hound off the leash unless you too are a hunter. Her instinct to track and hunt is stronger than the sound of her name, your pleas, favorite treats, even cheese. No purebred, a mutt from Alabama, part hound, part beagle. Still, centuries of breeding have formed her. She is captive to her own alertness. Eyes steady on that place in the garden where the woodchuck will dare to appear. Or if he does not, she rests her head on the window ledge, but keeps her eyes sternly fixed while I also go about my work, knowing there's not a chance that any creature will surprise us. 2. Once on an ice-bound winter's day, she slipped out of the car and was gone over the brittle fields. We chased her, calling, sternly at first, then begging as she kept herself elusive and us in her sight. This went on for hours. We tried sitting on a frozen clump of hay, hoping she would come to us. She circled, like Yeats' falcon. I was about to give up. I thought, absurdly, this is how it must feel to be God. You have made your creation free, or have given it enough freedom so that it can choose one thing or another. And through some instinct that defies self-preservation, it chooses the thing that will hurt it the most. And all the strength of all your love cannot bring her back. It chooses the thing that will hurt it the most. Eventually, we cornered her against a fence. This next poem is about a video installation I saw at MoMA a few years ago. I like America, and America likes me. When the man and the coyote are in black and white, there is an air of anthropology, an early documentary of something primitive. Or they might be in film noir, the man playing the tough guy. But I Like America, and America Likes Me was made in 1974. It is filmed performance art and action. The man has brought props into the room, gloves, a shepherd's crook, a triangle, and a blanket that he wears like a boy in a nativity play, or that he thrusts his stick out of or creeps out from under. This could frighten more than a coyote, but the coyote is also intrigued. Sometimes he pulls the blanket off the man, or grabs his stick, or circles round, or catches the gloves the man tosses to him. He obligingly pees on the Wall Street Journal each time it is delivered to the room. When the video is over, after half an hour, you're almost convinced. 2. But Joseph Beuys did not like America. He never touched down on American soil. To perform his action, he was swaddled in his blanket and spirited by ambulance from the airport to the New York City studio, where he would reckon with the coyote. You could say that a reckoning has to be made with the coyote, and only then can the trauma be lifted, boys said. He wanted to keep his hands and feet clean. He had wanted to remain innocent of contact with American soil because of Vietnam. And it's fair to say that the attempt to exterminate coyote shows the same murderous mentality as well as stubborn futility at work during that war. For boys, the coyote was a symbol of the damage done by white men to the American continent and the native cultures. He had always had an interest in nature. When the Nazis came to Boy's hometown to stage a book burning, this Hitler youth salvaged Karl Linnaeus's Systema Naturae from the flames. And he had always had a penchant for performance. A volunteer for the Luftwaffe, when his plane was shot down in Crimea, he claimed that nomadic Tatar tribesmen rescued him from the snowdrifts, packing butter and whey about his body for warmth and nursing him in a cave. But boys had been found by a German search commando. 3. You could watch it all over again, but you are being edged off the museum bench by impatient tourists. Your questions would remain unanswered anyway. Where did the coyote come from? What happened to him afterwards? Joseph Boy has given him a hug at the end, but this seems a piece of performance, as when he walked about the room banging on his triangle like the youngest boy in the school band. Apparently, Boy conceives of himself as a shaman. In the Shawnee myth, Kukamthena, the grandmother, weaves a giant basket. When it is finished, the world will end. But each night, her little dog, like Penelope, unravels the day's work. And so the trappings of art are undone by nature. Back to you, Mark.
This next poem is called Visitation. And it's also kind of certainly an animal poem. And it too is set in my hometown back in Wisconsin. Visitation. My mother is alive and funny in the house above the marsh. I think she does not miss my father much, as he is still alive, though elsewhere. Now that the men and dogs are gone, the team of mules separated and sold off to Iowa and Missouri. Now that we put down the last Labrador, a curly-coated giant stinking in the kitchen, who loved a tennis ball arcing through the air more than his keeper, more than ducks or food, more than rolling in some putrefaction. Now that the yard is quiet, the guns slumbering and locked in their closets, the wild creatures have returned to the yard. The fork-horned buck gingers out of the woods to eat the windfall apples. The woodchuck undermines the retaining wall, bats, squirrels, a coyote printing his mute tracks in a loop around the house, which is now locked in a feminine quiet, and where my mother reads, works her puzzles, clicks her needles as she knits another sweater for a baby I'll never meet. I think she likes being unobserved. Husband gone, boys grown up strange and long since moved away. She does as she sees fit. Now it is just the creatures who watch her come and go, like the bobcat she startled when she stepped out on the porch, who looked up, saw her, then disappeared into the trees. He left no tracks, no whiff of musk or scat, and so my mother wonders, to no one who will hear, if the cat was ever really there at all. This is another small prose poem called Once Forgotten. The old woman kept the tulip bulbs in the basement to keep them from the muskrats, overwintered their geraniums in a barrel. She fed the water snake who lived in the boathouse, flicking him little stars of meat, which he rose up to catch, his body black as the night's shadow. When we played down in the storm sewers and didn't come home, she walked through town and shouted into the grates, "Tweety, are you down there?" She didn't care. When she cleaned a carp, she kept the lucky stone from inside its head as a bingo chip, chopped the carp into chum. I bought her Chesterfields when she asked, and she smoked them in a blue fog in the kitchen, her frying pan in the oven to keep the flavored grease. When she taught us to shoot, she took us to the dump so we could practice on unlucky rats. She taught us to clean sunfish and crappies and pike. When we needed a puppet, she sewed us a puppet. When we were sick, she fed us peppermint schnapps. The old woman kept a broken porcelain doll and a thick severed braid in the cedar chest at the foot of her twin bed. Pure sentimentia. "Shit or get off the pot," she said as we played penny ante with ourselves. Her house by the river shook from the trains. The barge lights stroked the dark bedroom in the night. She made turkeys with pine cones and pipe cleaners glued sequins onto styrofoam balls. Once she made kolaches, but never again. The pork roast was always smothered in kraut. And when she forgot all of it, forgetting to eat, forgetting to dress, forgetting even where she was, waking up wet and cold on the floor. Me, she forgot me too. Wind blew through the pines out on the sand prairie, and that's what she became. She forgot me, and I was forgettable. Once forgotten, I could walk away and be free. Back to Tessa.
Thank you. My next poem is about a saint and a bird, this time a swan. Hugh of Lincoln lived in the 12th century, and every word of this poem is supposed to be true. Then I'll read a poem about a snake. Saint Hugh of Lincoln and the Swan. This swan was known for its ferocity. An immense bird, it drove off the other swans and claimed for itself the lake at Stowe Park. Still, it was captured and brought to the bird-loving bishop, who fed it bread from his hand. They became inseparable. The swan guarded the bishop as he slept, and threatened any who came near, great wings outspread, bill agape. It would brook no interloper. Thrust from his Carthusian silence, hauled out of the cloister, the bishop was barred from his solitude. Now, when at his residence in Stowe Park, he found a measure of peace. Each liked to cast on one another a look of quiet regard, the bishop studying the yellow butterfly shape on the black bill and the amber crescent behind the bright black pupil. The bishop's last visit to Stowe Park was marked by the absence of the swan. Instead of the usual joyful trumpeting and outspread wings and escort into the house, the swan stayed on the lake. After 3 days, it consented to be caught and was brought into the house, but stood dejected and listless before the bishop. After the bishop died, 6 months later, it remained on the lake in impenetrable solitude. Do you have memories, my snake? Do you have memories, my snake, of what you were like in that skin before its shedding? Are you free of shame, or are you suffused with it? Is that color a memory wanton on your shiny back? Listen, Schumann said, the angels speak in tones, articulating what cannot be articulated in the way our vertebrae articulate, separate, but still connected, a jubilant recreation, as when you shed yourself not once, but many times. Now that Robert Schumann has been introduced, I'm going to tell you about his whole family. He was married to another musical genius, Clara Schumann, who, as you will hear, he first met when she was 8 years old. Each year we hear more of her own compositions. 5 pieces for 4 voices. 1. Mooning like all 17-year-olds. This time Robert Schumann thinks he's in love with Herr Caruse's wife, Agnes. Caruse runs Colditz, once a castle, now a hospital for the incurably insane. There it is, looming over Zwickauer Mulder's blue, an immense, stern, white-windowed shadow. Down the hill from the castle, they sit in the parlor. 8-year-old Clara Wieck plays the piano, a pretty, solemn child and a genius. Schumann decides to ask her father for lessons. He fastens his eyes again on plump-cheeked Agnes, but that castle up there, the bars on the windows, that phrase, incurably insane. The key turned in the lock and then lost. Colditz Castle shadows his mind with a horror. True love sits playing the piano, but she isn't grown up yet. So Robert doesn't recognize her, though he knows he's in the presence of something. True love's nemesis, Clara's father, sits with arms folded. The future does what it always does, slides invisibly past to its locked rooms to sit on its secrets. Only Clara feels it. Her skin pricks with goose pimples, and when her eyes happen to meet Robert's, she sees a kind of flash in the air between them, and she plays a wrong note. Her father scowls and taps his foot. 2. Even when dreaming, even in his waking dreams, Johannes Brahms had not imagined this degree of happiness. As well imagine naiads in trees, mermaids in the sea, as the atmosphere in the Schumann house that first night he touched the brass to the door and was blown inside as if a sudden storm outside was jealous. The laughing swarm of children, the warmth from an enormous fire in the hearth, and the whole place ablaze with candles, the fragrance of cakes baking, and then an ecstasy rising above this happy domesticity from the piano. Music that so shook him that he took in his arms the 5 children that hung about him, squeezing tightly. He had never heard it before. He was as sure of that as he was sure that it was the work of Robert Schumann, and that he'd never heard such brilliant playing in his life, nor seen such a beautiful woman. So it wasn't such a fairy tale as it had seemed at first, but there was enchantment. Schumann himself had come in. They had all welcomed him, embraced him, and he an unknown, beardless boy. 3. The Rhine on a February day, cold and dark, as cold and dark as he was himself. They belonged together, the Rhine, the February day, his darkened mind. Robert Schumann dropped off the bridge to the river's dark heart. He was pulled out. Some weeks before, he had stood conducting, after the music had stopped. The musicians tightly held their instruments in a sickened grip, watching the music only Schumann could hear. And it was like that now, everything cross-purposed. He struggled to get back into the water, failed. He made it back to the bridge, gathering to itself the icy sky and the frozen earth, and was marched back to the house where he and Clara lived with their 6 children. Another was on the way. His end would take 2 turgid years at Endenich, while syphilis shrank his brain. Even then he had to starve himself to death. At Endenich, he had a limited freedom. He could walk to Bonn to visit Beethoven's statue. He could play the piano until he lost all sense of timing. But the choirs of angels that sang to him from heaven were consumed. by demonic chorales and symphonies that dragged him down to furthest hell. He asked visitors to bring maps, and to save himself, he found the familiar names of towns and cities, and there carefully anchored his diminishing self. 4. All Europe stormed the concert halls to hear her playing, a prodigy. Robert Schumann was sick. Clara, his muse, must earn the money. She returned to touring, to the limelight. They were saying that she went to the piano like a priestess to the altar. How could she help it? When she had spent the past dozen years swelling, giving birth, laboring out babies, it seemed to her that the human body was the least human thing. There was something like clockwork, the sickness, the 9 months, the squalling infant, then the constant worries, always pulled into motion by this weight and that weight. Now they were saying that she played with purity. She was still filling the concert halls. Her precise fingers warmed the keys, a light dazzling down the keyboard back and forth, leaping, sinking into the hearts of the rapt audience. She played the works of Robert Schumann until audiences learned to love them. 5. Of Robert and Clara Schumann's 7 children, only Felix, the youngest, was remarkable, and he died young, like Julie, the beauty, whom Brahms secretly loved. To be normal was the least that Clara could expect. Ludwig, the oldest, was slow. He stumbled, waved his arms about, and was clumsy. He was known for his upright and loving nature. Still, his mother wished God would take him from us. At 21, he was diagnosed with a spinal disorder. Clara had him committed to Colditz. The doctors recommended it. He wrote to her, begged her to come, and when she did, he tried to convince her that he didn't belong there. But she could see the shadows were closing about him. She thought her heart would burst with the pain, but thank God she had her work. She resolutely pushed all thought of him away. Everyone in the family rehearsed the same phrase over the years. The shadows were closing about him, they said, until he was buried alive. He was buried alive there for 30 years. The shadows were closing about him. He was going blind. Ludwig had one narrow room in Colditz Castle. There was a window, barred, that looked down the hill. He kept a candle burning because he could still see the flame. Once, on the windowpane outside, a moth lit. He could watch that too, its wings breathing, opening on both sides of the candle's flame, and this sight of a winged flame entered his heart so that for a moment he was warm. It was a memory, he supposed, that warmed him. Of his brothers and sisters, of his father, of music, of being happily crushed in the inexplicably tight embrace of love. So this last poem from me is about a painting. It's about another saint and more birds. I personally haven't seen Giotto's St. Francis frescoes, and this poem does depart from its two-dimensional inspiration. A scene from Giotto's Life of St. Francis. The birds fly down, all eyes and ears, for the skulls of birds are mostly eyes and ears. Ravens, crows, magpies, hawks, and owls, those scavengers and predators, are first within earshot of the sermon. My little sisters and brothers, creatures of the sky, each of you knows and serves your Creator better than we humans do. Always and everywhere you sing praises to God and are unaware of the sin of ingratitude. With this, Francis falls silent. humbled by his listeners, the birds, and rapt, enchanted by his own poetry, the dance of notions and invention that, like seed burst, floats freely and with exuberance in the air, in updrafts and downdrafts of listening. And thank you for listening. Back to Mark.
I'm just noting the time here, so I'll just read one more, and then we can go into if there are any questions, we can answer them.
We have a few. We can go to those. If you want to read more than one, you can. It's entirely up to you, Mark.
I'll just read one more,
okay,
and then we'll do the Q&A. So
sounds great.
Okay, thanks. This poem is, I'll just preface it by saying that everything in it is true. How about that? It's called My Night with Jeffrey Dahmer. My night with Jeffrey Dahmer, like any night spent out in a bar, this one doused in the pink and blue of neon, 1989 Formica and brushed metal and the spin of sound in the club, while downstairs in a darker bar where the older men enjoyed each other's company and where I had gone to cool off, a man stood next to me and knocked my beer to the floor. So sorry, he was very sorry, hand on my arm as I bent to pick up the bottle, one hand on my arm, the other signaling to the bartender, holding up a finger, then pointing to the empty I proffered, put on the wooden counter, bottle which the keep swept away, replaced, a cold green glass already sweating a bit, beating in the heat of the basement. He was a stranger, older than I was by a decade or more, blonde and mustached, big glasses, some farmer's son, a bit out of date, stuck as he was in the country, a man driven into the capital to spend a night among others of his kind, away from his mother's kitchen, the chilled hum of the bulk tank, and the cows whose needs were at the center of a life spent in their service. But no, he was from Milwaukee, he said, though to me his words were unimportant. So sorry, let me get you a new one, let me buy you one. And so he took out his wallet and handed over his dollars, and I suppose I looked to see if he had left a tip, since I always look for this, having done already the work of service, in which you depend on the manners and guilt and sense of custom of those you attend, their generosity, their goodness, their notion of what is normal and right, what to offer to others in exchange for their help, their attentiveness here. Let me buy you a beer. So sorry for my clumsiness. Let me put this hand on your arm. Do you live here? Are you at the university? Do you like the music? Did I tell you my name? His questions, the questions of any curious man talking to a farmer's son in a bar in Madison, Wisconsin, asking my name, which I withheld, my name, which I keep lodged between my teeth, under my tongue, in the pocket of my clavicle, in the scar on my eyebrow, in my belly, in the sack of my scrotum, in my head, my hand, my arm, which he touched lightly, my mouth, my teeth, my tongue, which began to move, unlock, give up its wariness, give in to say, my name is Mark, what's yours?
Gave me the creeps. I hate to say, what happened next?
Right.
I think everybody did. Thank you. Those were absolutely wonderful readings. So appreciate it. And we do have some questions. And one question is that can actually be directed at both of you. And it's basically got to do with what drew you to poetry as opposed to other forms of long form narrative. Tessa, why don't you start us off? Was there something in particular? Have you always been a poet, or was it something you came to later?
I started writing poetry pretty early on, in early days in college, and mostly I actually write novels. So I do write long form. And what draws me to poetry is when there's some image or event that feels like it needs to be condensed. You will have heard from my poems that some of them are not very well condensed, but at least they're not novels.
Do you have a preference for one form or the other?
I don't think so.
What about you, Mark?
I was not a kind of precocious child who wrote poetry, you know. I mean, that was not something that I thought was even possible, you know. I mean, I didn't, you know, I sort of embarrassingly, I think I was probably in my 20s before I realized there was such a thing as a living poet. So, you know, that it was an option was sort of a surprise to me. I think I was probably in college when I actually remembered the moment when I accidentally, I was a German major, foreign language major, and I had to register for an English credit. And I thought these were back in the days when you would sort of go to the actual room at the University of Wisconsin, and there would be a blackboard, and you would write your name after a number, and that would get you the place in the class. And it was sort of confusing list of class numbers across the top of the blackboard. And I thought I was signing up for Chaucer, but it turns out I was signing up for creative writing. And I wound up accidentally registered. I got my registration card and it showed I was registered for this creative writing class. And so I found myself in a class where we started reading and talking about poetry. And I remember one of the very first poems, you know, kind of 20th century poems that I read in that class was The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. And it was a poem of such kind of bottomlessness, of, in some ways, incomprehensibility, and yet it was almost like a spell, you know. It had such incredible depth and mystery to it. And then we got to talk about it afterwards. And I think sort of at that moment, the die was cast, and I thought, I just want to keep having this particular conversation. There's a way in which we, you know, the way in which we're able to engage with the work was really thrilling to me. And I loved the idea of poetry, of language having this affiliation with music, of it being about a kind of creating patterns of language, of using rhyme and metrical pattern, and you know, working that way. I was thrilled. And I would say, I did also think I wanted to write fiction. And I took a fiction writing class with Lori Moore, with the fiction writer Lori Moore. And she, it was quite I'd written these, you know, my terrible stories as a you know, 20-year-old, and I took them into her to read them, you know, to have my one conference with her. And she said, I've read your stories, and here's what I see. You're really good at describing things and creating tone. And here's some other things. Nothing happens. No one ever speaks to anyone else. And at the end of your stories, your characters disappear. Why don't you take a poetry workshop?
That's great advice.
That was kind of it. You know, I mean, I thought, oh, yeah, that's probably the way to go.
That's great. That's great. Well, what a fortuitous, you know, miss.
Yeah, her real talk.
Mistake. Yeah.
Real talk from Lori Moore at that moment.
Right. And so, and there's two parts to this question. The second part of Kendall's question was, what's your inspiration? What inspires you? Do you do you gather your collections, or do you have an overarching idea for a collection of work, or is it an organic process, Tessa?
Yeah, definitely an organic process. So far, I haven't put a collection together with the idea in mind that these poems should go together. I'm inspired by this thing or that, or something interests me while I'm reading, and I want to explore it further, and that exploration ends up being a poem.
Mark, what about you?
I think much like Tessa, You know, for me, poems are not about me having something to say in particular. You know, I think like if I approach the writing of poems as there's something that I want to say and therefore I'm going to put it in a poem. I don't work that way, and I don't really know that poems work that way. You know, I think that poems are about tracing something that you don't know. They're about asking a series of questions, and the poem is the kind of document that you create that shows that exploration, that is kind of following the path of what you don't know until it begins to coalesce and reveal something. You know, I believe that our poems are smarter than we are, and that, you know, it's our job to kind of enter into a state of meditative expectancy, and to, you know, and then to, I usually begin by describing. I also believe like in the integrity of individual poems as opposed to thinking about the kind of bigger picture. I think poems are like paintings or pieces of music or a dance or something. They're like complex individual works of art. And I want to make one of those things. And I want it to be durable, and I want people to be able to enter into it. And I want it to sort of speak to the tradition of the art in some way and to try and reinvent it in another way. And so that's what I am doing when I'm trying to write a poem. I think I throw a lot away. I write badly. It doesn't bother me. It just is, you know, the important thing is actually making it happen at all. And in terms of putting together a larger collection, I just keep trying to write individual poems. And over a period of time, if you then stand back and look at them, you begin to see where your obsessions have led you. You begin to see what kind of psychological underpinnings have been there all along. They begin to sort of reveal things to you about yourself and about how the poems might coalesce. If I ever predetermine that, when I have sort of overreached and overplayed my hand, the poems end up kind of dead. There's a whole book between my first and my second book. I wrote a whole other book, which I threw out, and it was overdetermined, right? It was a project, and I learned a very important lesson in doing that, and that I never want to do something like that again. You know, for me, it has to be about a kind of accidental discovery.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. There's a question here from Itan who says, can either or both of you speak to your revision process? And how do you go about distancing yourself enough from the experience that inspired the initial poems, enough to be able to revise it? Tessa.
Revising never ends. I have to confess that I revised some poems as I was reading. I just can't stop. They just seem endlessly revisable. And how do you get the distance? That's a very good question, because you can get to a place where you keep revising, and you should, you know, we know of people like Wordsworth who went back and looked at the poetry of his youth and revised it all, and we all like, oh no, that's not better. So I don't know how you get distance, but for me it's a never-ending process.
You have to have a cold heart some of the time, and you have to sort of be able to kind of see your work, you know, for what it is, and you know, and there's that sort of, when you're writing a poem, I think it's you're doing these sort of two parts of your mind are at work. There's the sort of animal brain, there's the part of yourself where, you know, you're all id, and then there's the conceptual intellect that's always there trying to organize and categorize. And the important thing in writing poems, I find, is that I need to give that part of my mind a job, and that's often about form. That's often about some sort of formal mechanism that I'm begin to employ in the poem, so that these other things kind of slip in underneath. And when I'm revising, I try and, you know, to sort of stand back from the poem and begin to, you know, let the essence of the poem kind of come forward, you know, and just figuring out what what's important in this poem, and begin to clear the other things away, to refine it, to pare it down, typically for me. I think that other part of revision too, as Tessa was saying, people going back after a long time and revising things. I certainly look back at things that I wrote, I mean, my first book came out when I was 29, and I look at that person and I barely recognize him. I see some version of myself, but we have to forgive ourselves for having once been 29, and sort of be able to say, like, that was the best poem I was able to write at that moment in my life. I was putting everything I had into it, and it's important to kind of recognize that and appreciate that aspect of oneself.
Yeah.
But I'm always interested in making the very next thing I write the best thing I write. That's what we always want.
Right.
Yeah. Is it hard to walk away? I mean, do you know when something is finished? I've talked to poets before that knowing when it's finished is always a kind of movable benchmark. I mean, do you know when it's finished? Do you get a sense when you're writing when something is finished? Tessa?
It's movable. I mean, you can sit down and write something and I go, yes, I nailed it. And when you look at it the next day, that's not the way you feel at all. So.
5-4 lad. Mark, what about you?
Well, there's, I forget whose quote this is, but poems are not finished, they're only abandoned.
Oh, I love that.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I have some faithful readers who often tell me if a poem needs more work, and I rely on them.
That's good. There is a sort of, it's some interesting information here from Iona. One of the questions that she asks is she feels that I'm paraphrasing her question, that we are so overwhelmed at the moment with consumerism and the need to acquire more goods and things, that we live very much on the surface of things. Do you feel that during the course of this pandemic that people are turning more and more to poetry and for comfort, but also how do you feel it benefits people? What can poetry give people that they're seeking right now, in your opinion? Tessa?
Well, Helen, I think probably you can answer best how many people are turning to poetry right now.
Yeah, a lot. A lot. We're getting books. We're selling a tremendous amount of poetry books, and we're seeing a large renewed interest in readings and new work.
Yeah. And as to why, this could be a very good time for interiority, for slowing down and listening. And poetry helps a person with all of that.
Yeah. I think I write poems because I don't want to be lonely, and I read poetry because it provides a kind of intimacy that I think other forms of literature don't quite achieve in the same way. You'll see that this room that I'm sitting in, this is a whole, actually a very large shelf that goes all the way up, and these are all, sort of books of poems that are there, and that's, I say, this is also where I write. When I'm sitting here and writing, all of these books of poems are behind me. And I often feel like these are the books I've read and loved and kept. And then I'm sitting here, looking forward toward this wall, but I'm composing my own poems with everything that I've read and loved and absorbed is sort of behind me. And I can reach back and I can pull something off that shelf and I can bring it forward. And you can read something that was written 500 years ago. You can read something that was written 60 years ago or 2 years ago and suddenly that, you sort of breathe in air, and if you read that poem out into the world and speak it out into the world, it's like that poet is actually using you as a sort of instrument. Your body brings that poet back into the world in some way. That to me is sort of literature's great magic trick. It brings the dead back to life. And, it's, for me, this period, it's going to be a year really before we find our way out of this time and place. We've all been so traumatized this last year. I think many of us have experienced great loneliness. We've, had to alter plans. Some people are mourning the dead. There's a lot that we have been through. And I think if people are reading more poetry, is because they crave that intimacy. And, and poetry is I think one of the most direct ways to do that. It provides that really reliably, and has since it first came into the world.
Yeah. Yep. I agree with that. I love that idea of the sort of being a conduit for the dead. Heidi, we've got time for a couple more. Heidi says, Mark, what state is your haunted house in?
Oh, yeah, I'm right here in the Hudson Valley, so not actually very far from Oblong Books. So just a little further north. So just a little bit, but it's here in the Hudson Valley. So I'm in New York State.
So, and somebody else said, Molly Salisbury has recommended, which I can email you, Mark, a great podcast about Stevens the Snowman.
Great.
That she recommends, which I will send. And lots of wonderful comments, how people were enjoying it. Great poems, great readings. Thank you, Mark and Tessa. That was from Stephen. Wonderful poems. The Schumann Cycle is amazing, from Michael Moritz. And I think that's it for our questions this evening. Well, thank you both so much. This was replenishing, to say the least. It's been marvelous. And I can't recommend the books highly enough. Please consider purchasing a copy, and then you can read through. There are other poems obviously included in the collection, many, many more than were read this evening, so for you to enjoy. So I hope you'll consider doing that. Lots of good luck with the books. Congratulations, Tessa. Congratulations, Mark. And thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tessa, and Helen, and everybody else out there too.
Yeah, thanks to the audience for coming. We hope to see you all again soon, and be well and stay safe, all of you.
Stay safe.
Good night.
Good night.